Hello and welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that we're talking about today is the Delorean.
I'm not even sure that, the Delorean car so much is the bad idea, more about how it was run.
Yeah, I don't want to be bashing on this particular vehicle, especially because it has enjoyed somewhat of a renaissance lately with the Ready Player One book coming out and now the adaptation of that movie. I think that there is a major nostalgia wave for the DeLorean, and time has certainly held it up as at least a car that people are still interested in. But the DeLorean Motor Company had some problems, and we're going to talk about those, Tony. And to start with, the thing that I did not realize about the DeLorean, Tony, is that it was not built in America. It was an American car, but it was built over in Northern Ireland in the late 70s and early 80s. And at that time, things were bad in Northern Ireland. This time is right in the middle of the massive wave of violence and religious strife in that area that is known somewhat euphemistically as the Troubles.
It's just a general title.
Real light, nice way of talking about people being killed by bombs and kidnapped and strife and riots happening all the time. And on top of that, on top of people hating each other because of what religion they were and what country they were made to be a part of, on top of that, the economy sucked in Northern Ireland. Somewhere around 40% of their population was unemployed.
Oof.
The book that I read talked about this at length and painted this picture of some households where you would have as many as 3 generations under one roof that had never held a job.
That's crazy to me.
It was bad. So around this time of real bad stuff happening, a ray of light appears, Tony. The DeLorean Motor Company was coming to Northern Ireland. Now, the DeLorean Motor Company, or the DMC as they called it over there, was the brainchild of John DeLorean, and he was an engineer from America who had previously helped design the Pontiac GTO muscle car, the Pontiac Firebird, the Pontiac Grand Prix, and the Chevy Vega.
I have a very special place in my heart for Firebirds. I used to own a 1968 one.
And he was had really made his stamp on the automotive world, but felt like that he was being held back. I did not get to read the specifics of his time at General Motors, but it does not seem to have gone well, because around the same time that he's founding the DeLorean Motor Company, he's also writing an entire book about how much General Motors sucked. Called On a Clear Day You Can See General Motors, if you're interested in checking that out. And he leaves them in 1973 with the dream of building his own car. And something that I figured out through this story is that John DeLorean was a visionary. And in a good and bad way at the same time, he was constantly excited about new and different ways of doing things. And sometimes that could lead to something really neat, like the gull-wing door design and the way they had this torsion suspension thing built specifically for that. And sometimes he would just decide that some manufacturing process that had never been tried before in manufacturing a car was a good idea, and it would have a lot of kinks to work out.
Sounds like a guy who was a little bit under-specialized in some of those areas to be making huge calls like that.
I like to think of him as, if we think about Steve Jobs as the sort of model CEO, John DeLorean was the guy who had the big ideas and tried to put them all together. He, at one point, was hoping to put the Wankel rotary engine in the DeLorean. I don't know if our friends know about the Wankel engine. That might be a future episode, although I don't know that the Wankel was necessarily a bad idea. It just could not compete with the cylinder-type engines.
Do you have any information on that? Because I have not heard of that engine.
I've read entire books about the Wankel engine. Like as a teenager, I hate to admit this. This sounds like such a nerdy thing, but it's essentially an engine where instead of having a cylinder, the ignition cycle takes place inside of this chamber where you're pushing this oddly shaped crankshaft around in a circle. I cannot describe it with words, but it is a very different engine principle than a standard cylinder type engine.
I've seen GIFs of this in action before. It's like a sort of triangle type shape with a lot of gears around it where it's forcing air in through an intake, it explodes, it moves the triangle a little bit along, and the exhaust gets forced out. So
this did not end up going in the DeLorean, Tony. They went with the basic 6-cylinder engine. And this seemed like a match made in heaven. John DeLorean wants to make cars. He needs people to make the cars. The British really want these unemployed Irish people who have nothing to do but protest to go to work, and they need a place to go to work. So John says, hey, you guys front me some money. We'll put the factory over there right in Northern Ireland. You'll solve my problem. I'll solve your problem. We'll all be good. And they do. They give him around $100 million in loans and grants to build his factory. And John DeLorean gets set up to produce the car of the future in no more than 18 months.
Sounds like the XFL.
Here's the first big misstep I think DeLorean takes. And it really is endemic with a lot of the problems that John has with the British government going forward. He makes promises that he just can't keep. He overpromises and underdelivers consistently. And this tends to break down relationships. And when you're dealing with $100 million relationship, you can see how that would get a little bit tense. And the thing was, he should have known that 18 months was crazy. Everybody else around him knew. He came from the automotive industry. He knows how this process works. So the fact that major car companies who have been doing this for 100 years still take 3 years to bring a new model to market should have been a good indicator of what would be necessary. I don't know if this was an outright lie or if he was just insanely naive about how long this would take, but regardless, it took more than 18 months, Tony.
I'm sure he thought that a lot of it was that they just weren't working fast enough because it's a huge corporate structure and everything, or at least that's why most people think a small business is able to move a lot quicker and switch faster. But they already have the built-up infrastructure. They have the engineers. They have the factories. They have everything already set up. So for them to take 3 years is probably about as fast as you want for a car like that.
And I will say, to the DMC's credit, they do get a good amount of work done. They don't get it in 18 months, but it is something like 24 months. So, kind of okay. I mean, they do it faster than they probably should have been able to do it. And in late 1978, the people of Northern Ireland start to go to work at the DMC factory. Many of them for the first times in their lives having a job. And yes, inevitably the 18 months come and go. And John DeLorean, because he's not selling cars yet, has to go to the government and ask for more money. And this cycle will happen several times throughout the very short life of the DeLorean Motor Company, with John asking for more and more and the government getting increasingly frustrated with his inability to produce cars and then to produce them at the rate and sell them at the rate that he said that he could. Gradually, though, the DeLorean Motor Company does manage to work out the logistics of the assembly process, and the workers start building DeLoreans. And if we're going to be specific, they start building the DMC-12. That is the model number of the DeLorean. I know that there was only one ever built, so it makes sense just to call it a DeLorean. But officially, the name of the car is the DMC-12.
Yeah, or call it the DMC-1 or something like that.
Well, I'll get to... we'll talk about why it's called the DMC-12 in a little bit, Tony. I do want to add... I've sort of skipped over the logistics and the whole process of assembly. I read a book that went in great detail about all of that stuff. It was called The Delorean Story, The Car, the People, the Scandal. And if you're interested in the minutia of setting up a brand new auto manufacturing process, I heavily recommend that book because that guy did not hold back with the details. Kind of small picture more than big picture a couple of times, but it was a fascinating read. And they get DeLoreans rolling off the line, and it's slow at first, right? They're still working the kinks out as they're building this car. Because of the rushed production schedule, they've started building cars before they had really finalized the plan. And this is actually, you could debate whether this particular thing is a bad idea or not, Tony, because John DeLorean's vision was not to have specific year markers between iterations of the car's work. He thought if you think of a good thing, if you come up with a way to improve the car, just improve it now. Like, do the thing and just keep them rolling through and rolling through. And on the one hand, that lets you improve gradually without having to wait for the 1 year mark. On the other hand, what it meant was that you're making changes to the car literally as it's being built.
I could see that being very fragmented for mechanics and other people trying to find the right parts and trying to make these cars run right.
It was very fragmented. And just one example of this, there were several things that again, this book went into a lot of detail, but at one point, the casting method for the wheels was found to be faulty. The metal was cooling down too quickly before it had fully filled the mold, and so there was danger there. And they swapped over the casts. And the new casts had a new style of wheel, but they took the old style and put it on one side and took the new style and put it on the other side in the hopes that drivers wouldn't notice because they couldn't see both sides at the same time. The writer of the book said he doubted that there was ever a single DeLorean. I think this is a little bit of exaggeration, but that there was ever a single DeLorean that came off that was exactly the same as another. That's how incremental the changes were.
And they made like tens of thousands of cars, didn't they?
I don't have a specific number on how many they made, Tony. 10,000 might be. It was not. They were not in business for super long, and they were not making cars real fast at any point in the factory's history. There were other problems too. The doors tended to leak. The seals around those big gull wings things were hard to get right. And I think a lot of things happened in shipping as well. Because you're shipping things from Northern Ireland to America, you ran into a lot of difficulties there. The engine was initially rated to 27 miles per gallon, and then they found out that there had been a leak in the testing process and that it was actually running at about 16 miles per gallon.
So it's basically a large truck.
Essentially. And at the time, there was this new gas guzzler law that meant every mile per gallon under 22, I believe, meant that you had to pay $150 per vehicle per mile per gallon under that limit.
Yeah, my car gets like 30 and it's $75 to register. I can't imagine in 1979 paying like $700 to register your car.
No, it would be paid by the company that was making the car.
I see.
It was an import tax. So because of this, because of the fragmented process, possibly because of the lack of skill in the workers, although the book that I read did not lay that out as a problem, Tony. I'm bringing this up just from personal curiosity. I think that the fact that some of these guys had never worked before in their lives, and you bring people together into an automotive manufacturing business that have never manufactured an automotive product, you might have some issues. I don't want to. I'm not saying anything against the Northern Irish, okay? I don't want a car bomb under my car. Bad joke. I'm sorry. But I think that might have contributed as well. Regardless of the reason, though, there was a very expensive operation set up in America as the cars were being imported to test all of them, to check for defects, to make sure that the quality control was good. And that became a huge cash sink for DeLorean.
Well, also, if you did find a car with defects, you either have to fix it on site or send it back.
You would send it back, and then you would notify the factory that there was a problem as well. And then they would have to fix things as they were doing them. I would assume that there would be a process, not just like, well, this one car has this thing loose. If you found a lot of weather stripping loose that was supposed to seal the doors, maybe you would have to figure out what was going wrong with the process back in Northern Ireland. But it was money, is the point. Way more money than they had. On top of that, Tony, it turns out that building a factory in a country that is essentially experiencing a civil war can have its difficulties. And just as the factory's starting to get its feet under it, the troubles flare up again. There were some Catholic protesters that had been imprisoned, and the rules were being changed about how they were allowed to be treated. So previously they were treated as prisoners of war, and the English decided not to do that, which meant they had fewer rights as prisoners, and they went on hunger strike. And as you might know, if you don't eat for a while, eventually you die. And when these guys died, more riots started to flare up. And these riots interfered pretty significantly with the operations of the Delorean factory, to the point where they started going to the government and getting secret info about the projected life expectancy of these protesters and working around those death expected dates with their production. So they would work ahead on certain things that they knew they wouldn't be able to do if there was a riot leading up to these expected death dates. And then when there would be the riot, they would be able to keep putting stuff together as best they could.
I mean, it's morbid, but it seems like it would make sense to try to make sure your labor force isn't going to be rioting and understand when you just need to shut things down for a little bit.
There were also issues with both sides, Catholics and Protestants, claiming that the DeLorean factory employed more of the other group. They had to take a tally of their workers to see who was where, and eventually they did manage to find out that it was basically even, and that helped to quell that problem. They, at a certain point during the rioting process, had soldiers stationed inside the factory, but not visible. Like, these guys are hiding under desks and stuff with these mobs outside throwing firebombs at some buildings, waiting for things to get out of control, ready to shoot these people if it does. And the guys in the factory having to act like everything's normal so that it doesn't get even worse.
That's insane to me that these people would just be like chilling under a desk and hanging out until, like, just in case they're needed. It's like, this is what you signed up for in the military.
When the cars finally did start flowing off the production line in earnest, it came at the worst possible time for car sales. In this year of 1981, the American auto market had severely stalled due to a really bad winter. It's just a fact that, like, when it's freezing cold, you don't want to go out and buy a car. And this was not just a problem for DeLorean, okay? There were factories, like, from the big three that got shut down, at least for the time being, because so few cars were being bought during this time.
And I'm sure whenever you're looking at that type of weather, you're not going to be looking at a sports car as much as something that might help you get through the snow.
On top of that, sales were even worse because the price tag had ballooned from the expected $12,000 to $25,000. That's why the car was originally called the DMC-12, because they thought they were going to be able to sell it for $12,000.
That's a huge price increase. Like, what did you say the second number was? It's like 10 grand higher.
25,000?
13 grand higher, so it's more than double the cost.
Yes. And you got to remember, people were very excited for this, so there was expectation ahead of this. No doubt John DeLorean had talked up the $12,000 price point. People had seen the models and the prototypes and were very excited for this car initially. But if you have that kind of increase from what people are expecting, it's really going to hurt you. And so the company sinks deeper and deeper into this financial hole. They don't have nearly enough money coming in. They're trying to fake it till they make it with the auditors. making it look like they've got money when they don't. They're not paying the people who are supplying them with parts. There was one instance where one of the parts suppliers actually commandeered a shipment of DeLorean cars as payment. And when the DeLorean company went to court to sue them, the courts sided with the guys that took the cars and said, y'all should have paid. They're just trying to get what's theirs.
Yeah, I mean, their parts are there, and like it costs a lot to make those car parts.
It does. In 1982, the company goes into receivership, which is similar to our, I believe, Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Actually, receivership is a little bit closer to Chapter 7.
Thank you. I don't know a lot about bankruptcy, Tony. I haven't.
I was reading about it earlier today, so like over some companies that had bad Kickstarters.
And the idea with those kinds of bankruptcy is the company doesn't shut down immediately. They're hoping to be able to dig themselves out of the hole, but the control of the company gets turned over to some government entity. In America, it's the judge. A judge decides who's going to get paid and how long they're going to continue in bankruptcy. And in Britain, it was a government official who, by all accounts, actually really tried to do right by the company and do the best he could to get them out of the hole that they dug. Unfortunately, things continued to go sour until a glimmer of hope, Tony. John DeLorean, at the last second, negotiates a cash infusion from a British investment company called the Financial Services Incorporated. And they offer a $100 million loan to the DeLorean company to keep this factory rolling.
It's a lot of cash.
It's a lot of cash. And there's a deadline, Tony. The British government has put a deadline of October 20th on the factory shutdown. They say after that, no mas, it's over. If you can get things together before then, fine, we'll keep going. But that's it. And October 19th, the paperwork is sitting on John DeLorean's desk. All he has to do is sit down and sign this paperwork. The courier has to take it to the certification agency or whatever, and the DeLorean motor car company can stay in business. And here's the twist, Tony. John DeLorean never signs the paper.
Do we know why?
We do know why. And this is the most interesting thing about this story to me. Something that I did not realize until I started studying this. On the morning of October 19th, with the paper that would have saved his car company sitting on his desk, John DeLorean flies to Los Angeles, California, to meet with a man named James Timothy Hoffman. John DeLorean thinks he's going to buy a whole bunch of cocaine from James Timothy Hoffman. Hoffman has come to DeLorean with this deal as a business proposition. He set it up, and DeLorean thinks that this is a good way to make some money, I guess, and bites the hook. And it is a hook, Tony, because Hoffman is an FBI informant. And on October 19th, in Los Angeles, California, with the paperwork that would save his company sitting on his desk, waiting to be signed, John DeLorean is arrested on drug trafficking charges and brought to trial. He never signs the paperwork, and the DeLorean company on October 20th goes under.
Man, if he would have just signed that, like, he could have been doing that from jail or through trials, through everything else. He could have, like, hell, who knows if he would have even gotten charged with that level of a charge.
The worst part of the story is he doesn't end up being convicted. The FBI gets slapped down for entrapment. This had been a whole big sort of flashy operation in the kickoff of Reagan's war on drugs. He had, right before this, had several of his radio addresses where he talked about how drugs were a big problem and how we were finally going to all get the government agencies coordinating together and cracking down on them. And it's he knew that this operation was coming. He knew that John DeLorean was going to be hit with this sting. It was a big flashy thing. Some of the financing from the British government actually dried up because Margaret Thatcher also knew that DeLorean was being targeted by this sting ahead of time. And it didn't end up holding up in court, but it did end up killing the DeLorean car. The DMC-12 actually ended up... Another weird little side twist to this. There was a lot of parts left over, obviously, and people still had DeLoreans, so that there was a business opportunity to selling these parts. And the company that bought these parts became the retail cheapster giant Big Lots. I don't know how many of you out there have Big Lots in your town, but we have one in ours. And
we have one as well.
They at a certain point sold off a specialty gold-plated DeLorean to one of their customers because they bought a bunch of the leftover parts from the DeLorean shutdown and ran that for many years.
I've heard that you can actually buy a pretty much brand new DeLorean because there's enough parts left over to make a few thousand cars. So you could actually, if you went to the right company, have them assemble a brand new one for you.
They're not cheap these days, though.
No,
which
definitely
is
not.
Why I don't want to dunk too hard on the DMC. They clearly had issues with honesty. John DeLorean, despite the fact that he was acquitted of the drug charges, was not a nice guy. He was going to try to buy a bunch of cocaine and make money off of it, guys. Yeah, even if it was entrapment.
That's what the CIA was doing at the time anyway, so it's okay.
He also apparently had other very shady business dealings that were being uncovered at the same time. I don't know all the details of that. But the DeLorean as a car has clearly endured in the public imagination. And I can't help but wonder, Tony, if they'd had as many chances as somebody like 3M had, if they'd just been able to keep pushing through and keep trying and keep perfecting, I can't imagine that they couldn't have turned it around. I mean, I don't know for a fact one way or the other. Business is hard no matter what. But these guys had a good product. They had a product that people wanted, that people still want. But they just couldn't get it together in the time they had, and it fell apart for them.
I mean, I suppose the real lesson here is that before you go buy drugs, you got to make sure you take care of your home life stuff.
Or
business
maybe
life stuff.
Don't promise more than you can deliver.
Oh.
That was my takeaway. But that is the sad and fascinating story of the DeLorean Motor Company. I really enjoyed learning about these people, Tony. I hope that our listeners did as well. That is all we have for this week. As always, if you guys have ideas that you would like us to take a look at, you can send them to badideasshow@gmail.com. No promises on... You can't tell us what to do, Tony, but we will certainly take suggestions. If you like this and you want to help support us, we have a Patreon. We're at patreon.com/humanechoes. Go over there, and for as little as $2 a month, you can get postcards from us. You can get early access to a lot of our YouTube videos. It's a really cool way to help us out, and we think that we provide some value to you guys as well. And we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
And one last note, if you're listening to this on audio form, we have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/humanechoes. If you're listening to this on YouTube and you want to be able to take this with you, we can pretty much have you download us at any podcast provider.
Bye, guys.
Bye.